Hey everybody, it's Gas and Core TV. It's your girl, Miss Public Info, here with the latest and greatest and sometimes hated updates of the most high-profile cases going on around the country. Today we're going to do two episodes. The first episode, we are going to cover the Sean Diddy Combs sentencing. So the official sentencing for Sean Combs is not until this Friday, October 3rd. However, the Department of Justice has filed their sentencing recommendations. Now, just last week, I let you guys know that the Department of Probation filed their sentencing recommendations. It is not public, but when the defense team for Sean Combs filed their sentencing recommendations, they sort of hinted at the Department of Probation's recommendations. And so that's how we know what theirs are. Now, the Department of Probation, they are recommending a 7.5 year sentence. The defense team for Sean Combs is requesting a 14-month sentence, which would essentially be time served. And the Department of Justice, which was just filed last night as we all were sleeping, and I was able to get my hands on it, 135 months, which is equal to tantamount to about 11 years in the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is recommending a maximum sentence for Sean Combs of 11 years. Now, I've talked to you all along about how the sentencing guidelines go. The All sides are looking at the sentencing guidelines. They're making their recommendations based upon the federal sentencing guidelines. Now, we know Ad Max Sean Combs could get 10 years for each count, but that is unrealistic given the circumstances of the case. However, the Department of Justice's recommendation of 11 years matches up with the guidelines, but it also matches up with what they said in terms of this is Director Jay Clayton, who's the new head of this division, and he has said in response to one of Combs's team's filings that the Department of Justice will be looking at a substantially higher sentence at this point. And the reasons for that, Jay Clayton said, and he made a very, crucial campaign for it in this 135-page doc, which we're going to get into here in a minute. Part of that is because Sean Combs is unrepentant. He's unrepentant. I've told you guys time and time again that this unaccountability that Sean Combs has been displaying the entire lifetime of this case is going to backfire. And it has now come home to backfire at this point because now the Department of Justice is saying he's not repentant. He won't take responsibility. At one point in the filing, I think they even say that he shares blame with the victims. He blames the victims for this happening. Now, this is very much what I sort of told you guys some weeks ago when I talked about the fact that Sean Combs sort of saying that his violent behavior was based upon the victim's actions was going to also backfire. Department of Justice, district attorney, whomever you're dealing with in terms of law enforcement, they do not like, in particular, when someone victim blames, especially if the defendant is violent, which Sean Combs has shown during the course of this trial, during the lifetime of this trial, as far as the evidence is concerned, that he is now. Sean Combs was able to circumvent the RICO sentencing. Okay, 11 and a half years, 11 and a half, I might add, not just 11 years, 11 and a half is what the DOJ is recommending. 11 and a half years is a far cry from a lifetime in the federal prisons. Okay, it's a lifetime that he was looking at. That is way shorter than what he was looking at in the first place. Now, of course, this past week they had a hearing rather, on whether or not the judge was going to acquit Sean Combs or grant him a new trial based upon some of the points that his defense team brought up, which was essentially that the definition of prostitution that the DOJ was prosecuting him under was incorrect. Now, the judge has yet to rule on that hearing. He's still waiting to rule. He likely will not rule on that. I'm guessing probably until Friday when his sentencing hearing is set. Now, just to sort of temper expectations, the likelihood of the judge, granting Combs a new trial or an acquittal is very, very low. This early in the post conviction phase of trials, it's usually a rejection on this. These are usually denied. But this is really, a Hail Mary pass, last ditch effort from the Combs camp to really sort of, seek justice. So they, in their, opinion, what their side feels is justice, to get him the fairness and equity they feel that he is not getting. So that's sort of the run up, the short and dirty of it. For those of you who want to stay to hear what the actual the filing said, please stay. I'm also going to go through some of the letters that came through from some of these victims. We have a letter from Mia, who you recall she testified during the federal government's case. We also have a letter from Chef Jordan, who has been very vocal about her alleged abuse there at the Combs camp and Two Star Island. We also have a letter from Devontae Nash, who was the stylist to both Combs and Cassie, and is also launching his own civil lawsuit, which was filed last week. Also, Devontae wrote other letters as related to Combs's bail request. So this isn't the first time, and also Devontae, he also testified during the federal government's case as well. So we're going to go through those letters. Stay if you would like, but if not, you've got the gist of it. The DOJ is recommending an 11.5-year sentence for Combs. This is paired up with the 7.5 years recommended by the Department of Justice and the 14 months requested by Combs' team. Okay, so let's get into it for those of you who would like to stay. Now, the Department of Justice was very clear. I'm going to go through this. I'm not going to go through all 135 pages, but I am going to go through this in a way in which, you get the gist of it. Now, this is, the first page and now the introduction of it. Indeed, in connection with sentencing, Cassandra Ventura, who along with multiple escorts was transported across state lines by the defendant for multi-day freak-offs in connection with count 3, of which the defendant was convicted, writes to the court that freak-offs were degrading and disgusting, leaving her with infections, illness, and exhaustion. And then they point to Exhibit A at 2. Ventura became addicted to drugs the defendant provided her. She still has nightmares about the defendant's physical abuse, which lasted more than a decade and left her with permanent scars all over her body. The defendant's abuse drove Ventura to suicidal thoughts, which she almost followed through on. She testified as much at trial. Ventura asked the court to impose a sentence that considers the many lives that the defendant ended with his abuse and control. The court also heard testimony and reviewed contemporaneous communications from Jane. This is Jane Doe, who we know to be Daphne Joy, who is also the mother of rapper 50 Cent's young son. Jane, who along with escorts was transported across state lines by the defendant for hotel nights in connection with count 5, of which the defendant was also convicted. Jane's testimony and communications detail how she was manipulated and beaten by the defendant. That evidence included a note Jane wrote to herself about how she felt violated and was tormented by how the defendant had placed and paid all of these harmful men on me and risked my health every single time for 2.5 years. The Department of Justice goes on. They go on to talk about the guidelines as it relates to the Mann Act, which I think everyone has had a little bit of confusion on because there's a lot of people saying, well, how can he be given such a strict sentence based upon transportation of prostitution? And I have repeatedly said during some of my episodes on this particular matter that one of the reasons for that is because Sean Combs has a propensity for violence. And when I'm talking about that, I am talking about the Cassie Ventura beat down, if you will, tape cut stemming from the Continental Hotel here in Los Angeles. I am talking about the multiple accounts of witness testimony that outline Mr. Combs as being violent not only to Miss Ventura and also to Jane Doe, but also his employees. And this is also during the time in which he was in cahoots with his staff at trying to uh, sort of organize these hotel nights with various uh, prostitutes or, sex workers. So that is what the DOJ is really explaining in this next part that I'm going to read of this filing. The defendants they go on, they say defendants who perpetuate violations of the Mann Act involving such violence and fear regularly face significant penalties. I'm going to repeat that for the cheap seats in the back. Defendants who perpetuate violations of the Mann Act involving such violence, stop, and fear, stop, regularly face significant penalties. The defendant should be no exception, particularly when his history and characteristics demonstrate years of abuse and violence. Stop. It's very important to outline these descriptions because when they talk about the fact that the Mann Act, if you perpetuate extreme actions of violence and invoke fear upon victims, this raises the significance of the penalties versus if you're just transpo sex workers, you may not face as stiff of a penalty. I need people to really understand what's being described here. We're not describing a guy who is just organizing sex workers and that's all he was doing. He was a spoke in the wheel. We're talking about someone who not only had people working at his behest, and then he was also organizing the transportation of the sex workers as well, but he was invoking violence and fear not only in his significant others or girlfriends or whomever, however you want to describe Miss Ventura and Daphne Joy, but also he was invoking fear into employees. He was also being violent with these girlfriends, but he was also being violent with these employees during the time in which he was setting up this sex worker transportation. Deontay Nash described this. Mia describes this. That's what we're talking about here. Now, the other bouts of violence that where we know that he has had activity in that wasn't connected to the transportation of sex workers, that is not what the DOJ is talking about. But people who did witness or experience violence under Combs, they're still allowed to write letters in support of Combs receiving stiff penalties because they've been victims of his violent acts. We also have a letter from Capricorn Clark that we're going to read as well. So I just want to make that differentiation. Number one, please understand why he's receiving the significant penalties in terms of the recommendation of the significant penalties he's receiving from the DOJ. And number two, understand who he was being violent against, that the girlfriends and employees who are being paid by him. And then number three, understand that those who had violent actions, violent actions against them, even if it wasn't in the same activity of the sex work or the transportation, they were just an employee, those people are still allowed to give their support for the recommended sentence, harsher penalties. They're still allowed to do that. So we're going to get into that. I mentioned that because the DOJ is getting into that in this next part of the filing. They say The defendant should be no exception, particularly when his history and characteristics demonstrate years of abuse and violence. Several former employees abused and exploited by the defendant, including one whom the defendant sexually assaulted. They're talking about Mia, submitted letters to the court in connection with sentencing. These letters uniformly ask that the court impose a sentence that reflects the severity of the defendant's conduct and his history and pattern of violence. Given the seriousness and duration of the offense conduct, as well as his decades of unchecked violence, consideration of the relevant factors under, and they give the code, weighs heavily in favor of a substantial sentence as well as the statutory maximum fine. The sentence imposed on the defendant should reflect the substantial psychological, emotional, and physical damage he has inflicted. Most significantly, the nature and seriousness of the offense, the need for deterrence, and to promote respect for the law and the history and characteristics of the defendant warrant a sentence of no less than 135 months imprisonment. Such a sentence is consistent with similarly situated defendants who commit Mann Act violations and is warranted here. And then they start to talk about the history, the lifetime span, the life cycle of this particular case. They start with the violent acts in which this investigation began. They talk about how it began in November 2023. They go into the grand jury investigation that began in September of 2024, which is literally just a year ago, really to the date. And then they go into another grand jury, April 3rd, 2025, just some months ago, that actually voted. The grand jury actually indicted him, and brought in a 5-count superseding indictment. You all might remember that. And they officially charged him with the following. And the following was racketeering, conspiracy, which we know he was acquitted on, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, 2 counts of those, one for Ventura, one for Jane Doe, which he was acquitted of both. And then the 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution related to Ventura and commercial sex workers. And then, of course, count 2. And then, of course, count 4, excuse me, and the transportation to engage in prostitution related to Jane Doe and commercial sex workers. And then they go through the litany of bail hearings. They go through the pretrial bail hearing that occurred in September 2024. You all may remember that, where Sean Combs tried to get out of jail at that point. And the judge in that particular bail hearing noted that his crimes, which happened behind doors, made it impossible to monitor him. And that's one of the reasons why Sean Combs has literally lost pretty much every bail hearing he's had, because much of his crimes that he's done really weren't able to be corroborated out in public viewing, because he would make sure strategically that they were done behind closed doors. And to that point, then the DOJ had a tough time being able to actually monitor, or the court rather, be able to monitor Mr. Combs behind closed doors, because of course he's not going to do these crimes out where people can see him do them. He's not a bold criminal. He's the kind of criminal who likes to be more cunning and covert and slick. And so because they were not able to monitor him appropriately, the judge in this case, which is Judge Tarnowski, a U.S. magistrate, she decided that she was not going to grant him bail. And that is the trend that we've seen over time now with Judge Submaranian, that these are the reasons why he was not granted bail in the first place. And actually, Judge Chernosky, when she denied him bail in September 24, she went on to say that the court further found that detention was warranted based on the defendant's history and characteristics, observing that given the allegations of violence and substance abuse, end quote, I don't know that I think you can trust yourself. And the defendant appealed the decision to another judge, which is Judge Carter, to whom the case was assigned to. And a bail hearing before Judge Carter proceeded just days after the initial bail denial. And Judge Carter also denied the defendant bail, finding that the defendant was a danger regarding obstruction of justice and witness tampering, which, of course, I have told you guys time and time again, Sean Combs was accused of witness tampering while he's been in the federal holding facility there in Brooklyn. Judge Carter went on to say that the defendant posed a significant danger to the safety of others in the community. And that is law enforcement's utmost concern. Is this person a risk to public safety? And if the answer is in any way, shape, or form yes, then it's going to be a no for you, right? So then in November of 2024, just a couple of months after these bail denials, these initial bail denials, he continues to try to get bail. He tried to get a bail renewal, and he was denied that as well on November 27th. The court denied the defendant's renewed motion for bail. So this would be really the third time that Sean Combs tried to get bail prior to trial. I think the total times that Sean Combs has tried to get bail is around 5, because then he tries to get bail after the trial 2 additional times up to now. So I think we're looking at 5 times he tried to get bail and 5 times he was denied bail. And the reason why that is significant, ladies and gentlemen, is because that actually plays into the court's distrust that Sean Combs can be monitored, as they said in the filing here, but also it plays into the fact of whether or not Sean Combs is a public safety risk. Now, he's had 2 letters, specific letters from ex-girlfriends. This Virginia young lady and this young lady, Carisha, known as Young Miami, who both specifically spoke to his risk to public safety, saying that they don't feel at risk. Now, that's interesting, only because Virginia talked about in separate interviews that he was, beating her up, dragging her across, the ground, making her lose a child. Young Miami has never made that assertion of violence or anything like that. But these are the only times in which we've heard from people, besides his family, that is, from people who've said, oh, we don't think he's a public risk. But these are also people who receive a large benefit financially to him being out of jail and not in. And as it relates to the court is saying he is a significant risk because even behind bars, and this was a part of the denial of the bail renewal, but even behind bars, the defendant has a propensity for violence when he's out, so he's a public safety risk, but he's also a serious risk for witness tampering, utilizing other inmates' calling cards, so that he could actually talk to different people on the outside to reach others to witness tamper, which Miss Virginia, the girlfriend, who was actually subpoenaed by the Department of Justice and did not show for trial, she was contacted that way. That's how she was contacted, which is the reason she didn't show up. So they go on and they say to this bail renewal denial. The judge says, and there is the open question as to whether the defendant could abide by conditions given his flagrant violation of the Board of Prisons rules. And they're talking about the witness tampering calling card thing. That's what they're talking about. And the misrepresentation made at the November 19th, 2024 hearing. Okay. And what they're referring to there, the misrepresentation there was that the government had knowingly obtained notes from the defendant that had been marked as legal, but they weren't legal. They were actually erroneous. They weren't legal notes whatsoever. So during a hearing on November 19th, 2024, addressing the defendant's allegations that the government was in possession of attorney-client privileged material, the defendant caused his attorney to present the court with a notebook marked legal to erroneously suggest that the government had knowingly obtained notes from the defendant that had clearly been marked legal. These actions form in part the basis of the government's request for the obstruction enhancement. And this is when Mr. Combs was accused of obstruction of justice because he lied and he tried to say that these notes that were marked legal were legal in fact, and that the government knowingly obtained these, which was not true. And then they're saying that because of this, that there should be an obstruction enhancement to his sentencing because he has tried to toy with legal materials, lied to the court about the actions of the government, which was proven that he did that. And he was also witness tampering with the phone calls in jail. Now they go through the trial, which I won't go through because we all watched the trial at this point. We know or read the trial or you paid attention to the trial. So you know what happened there, and we don't need to sort of go through that. But I will sort of pinpoint some of the violence that they talk about in this filing as it relates to Miss Ventura. They talk about that the abuse was horrible, dehumanizing, and indefensible. This, of course, in part was shown on that infamous Intercontinental Hotel video from 2016. They go on and they talk about that the fact that the video is overwhelmingly has overwhelming evidence of domestic violence. It is evidence of domestic violence. And so they go on and on and on. And then they talk about, even from the defense table's own words, and quote, it to get out of the RICO and the SEX trafficking charge. The defense said the following: if he was charged with domestic violence, we wouldn't all be here having a trial because he would have pled guilty because he did that, the defense said. The domestic violence is the issue. We're going to take the violence. Let's take the violence. Obviously, something happened. The video is very much domestic violence. This is all those quotes come from Sean Combs' team. And these are the quotes that are used and the video that is used to prove Sean Combs' propensity for violence, which is a sentence enhancer as it relates to the Mann Act, which basically concretes and gives sustenance to the Department of Corrections recommendation of this 11.5-year sentence, aka 135 months. Indeed, the testimony of over 30 witnesses, the defendant's conceded abuse, was detailed during trial. And they go through this. They go through all of these different sort of incidents of violence dating all the way back from 2009, dating all the way forward to 2018 or 18 or so, when their relationship ended. And they talk about Cassie Ventura being called a slut or a bitch after she spoke to a producer at a club appearance. And then the defendant went crazy and start stomping um stomping her face with his foot in the back of the Escalade. They go into the fact that Cassie Ventura had to actually go recover for a week at the London hotel because of her injuries. And this is despite the fact that Cassie wanted to go home to her mother. He wouldn't let her go. And then they go into the 2010 Prince party where Prince's security had to actually keep Cassie from being beat up by Sean Combs. But it didn't stop him from initially attacking her until his Prince's security team intervened. Then we go into the Capricorn Clark incident in terms of, Capricorn witnessing a 2011 beating that took place with Ventura and Combs. They have pictures that they show. Here's one of them here that you guys can see as I'm going through this. This obviously is Cassie Ventura here showing all of the wounds and the bruises that she received from Combs. Um, so these are the things that were shown during trial that some people didn't get to see because maybe you weren't paying attention or because we weren't there in person. They didn't release all of this in during the trial, but they did release some of the exhibits. And so this is a photo that Cassie Ventura's mother took of her bruises that she sustained from a beating in 2011 from the Capricorn Clark situation that involved Kid Cudi, or Kid Cudi, I'm sorry, Kid Cudi, which is AKA Scott Muscudi, who did actually testify. And then, Ventura's mother, who, testified during the trial as well, that um she said that Cassie finally told what he was doing to her, and said that she kept it a secret because she felt ashamed. She knew it wasn't normal. She said that she was constantly bruised up by this person who constantly said that he loved her and all of this, and she says it couldn't be justified anymore, and it couldn't be justified especially to her own mother. Here is a photo of Cassie here, where this is after a beating. He's taken a chunk out of her face, as you can see there. This is as a result of her being attacked by Combs. Devontae Nash talked about this when in his lawsuit that he filed last week, where he talked about how Combs walked into the room, smashed Cassie's head into a bed frame, and that he was beating her down. And this is where Mia, the assistant, and Devontae Nash, they both tried to close themselves in the room with Cassie to get away from Combs, but he pushed the door open, attacked her by hitting and kicking her. She got a gash on her forehead, as you can see here. Both Devontae and Mia, who was an assistant, jumped on his back in an effort to stop him, but he threw them both to the ground. And that, he just continued to slam her head into the corner of the bed frame, which caused the gush of blood to come from her head, which is what you're seeing here. And then, of course, he finally stopped and then said to turn to Nash and Mia specifically, but also Ventura, and said, "Look what y'all made me do," and then walked out. So this is what the DOJ is bringing forth now. They actually go through almost every single violent act verbatim of what Combs actually did. They go through every single violent acts in Jamaica, violent acts in September 2020. I'm sorry, 2015. They show other photos where she's here, where she has a blackened eye and some bruising on her forehead. Her hair is shaved because he ripped her hair out of her skull. There, they talk about an incident on a private plane. Um, that George Kaplan, who testified about violence he witnessed on the defendant's private plane, while members of the defendant's security team and other employees looked on. The defendant, who was in the back bedroom with Cassie, stood over Cassie, yelling at her angrily, and then he threw whiskey glasses at her, shattering them on the ground. And then, as the defendant threw the glasses at her, Cassie pleaded to others on the plane, "Isn't anybody seeing this?" And no one helped because they were all, being bullied by Combs, threatened with their job, all of that. They were looking out for themselves, but also it was a point where people just felt scared to intervene as well because they not were not sure what he would do. So he was allowed to really just be reckless in all of his actions. And this is essentially what happens to a person, talking about Sean Combs now, what happens when a person has no one that this person has to be accountable to or responsible to. And they're sort of just allowed to live and do things recklessly, not only to other people, but to themselves. And essentially what has happened and what we're in right now, this sentencing phase, is a result of self-destruction, essentially. So they go on into March 16. This is the Intercontinental Hotel video, so I don't have to repeat that. You guys have seen that. Of course, this is a still shot from the video. The still shot is showing Sean Combs stomping on Cassie, in that elevator scene there where she's sort of curled up in a fetal position there. And this is Cassie after the Continental Hotel situation. She has a busted lip, all of that. She was supposed to get to a movie premiere. I think she went, but she was not, her full self. And then we get to the September 2018 RAPE. Now, this is essentially where the defendant and Cassie break up. They end their relationship. They go to dinner, and after dinner, Ventura invited the defendant back to her apartment. And then he RAPED'd her on the living room floor while she cried and said no. She said that the RAPE felt like somebody taking something from her. And then afterwards, the defendant texted her and said the following: "I know I look bad to you. I could tell I didn't turn you on yesterday. I fell off, but I'm about to get my SHIT together," he said. And so these are the Department of Justice go on just to say this is just a sliver of the abuse that Ventura experienced at his hands, contrary to the defendant's assertion that the abuse was rare, and then also contrary to the defendant's assertion that he was in some ways, you know, compelled to these sorts of acts, not only because of drugs, but because of the fact that the victims sort of participated in this, that they made him do this. And so, Ventura went on to say, like, that the relationship was consistently abusive. She indicated that if you made the wrong face, the next thing you know, she was getting hit in the face. So it was just all the time, just she never knew what was going to happen. It just depends on what kind of mood he was in, which it seemed that he was always in a violent mood. And then they talk about the fact that, he always had firearms around, which sometimes he made Ventura handle those firearms. Now, for instance, at a club appearance in LA, Ventura carried the defendant's gun in her purse. Now, we know, those of us old heads who've been around since the early 90s, that this is very much on brand for Combs, because this is exactly what he did in the Sean Barrow club shooting situation, where he had Jennifer Lopez hide his firearm for him in her purse as they exited that club where there was an incident. And he actually, the woman who was shot in the face says that Sean Combs shot her But, you know, Sean Barrow ended up taking the brunt of that and he ended up going to prison for 9 to 10 years for it. Sean Combs got off on that. Uh, the magnificent and iconic Johnny Cochran, may he rest, was able to get Combs acquitted on those charges. But the gun in the purse is something that Combs does, and that's only a coward does that. You know, having your girlfriend, you know, hide your gun because you know she's less likely to be searched, or you know they're not going to look at. So you just put it, you give it to her to hide. You know, just a coward in my opinion. But Ventura, you know, she testified about that. She talked about guns that were in the car during the time that they saw Suge Knight at Mel's Diner in Hollywood back in 2008. So she talks about various incidents in the relationship where there were guns taken out from his safes here and there. And, you know, she says it always felt like it was a bit of a scare tactic, you know, and I know exactly what she means by that. You know, someone sort of trying to, you know, intimidate you on the slick just to let you know I have these firearms, so don't you get out of line type of thing. Okay, so we're moving on from that. We know about the freak ops. I'm going to skip through that. There's a lot to go through here. But the freak offs, only thing I want to say about the freak offs, and I talked about it before, was that, you know, Sean Combs has said over time that, you know, he didn't hire the people from Angels and Cowboys, the escorts from Angels and Cowboys directly, but that isn't true. And that was, that's talked about in this filing, and that was talked about during the trial court phase of this case because he had uh, talked to the escort service about some performance issues that he had with one of the escorts, to which the escort service says, well, what are you talking about? They're just there for comfort, or they're just there for company, or whatever the case is. So he wasn't able to even get his money back. But the performance issues he was talking about was the fact that the escort could not perform SE-actually. Also, when Jane Doe is brought to Aruba, he has already hired one of the escorts to arrive there prior to the time that she's there. So he's definitely involved in that. And then the DOJ go through, you know, the reasons why the 14th month sentence that's sought by Combs's defense is significantly basically would create, not avoid, a sentence disparity that, you know, essentially I'm going to get to this page because I kind of want to get into that, because I personally think that the 14-month request from the here we go, from Combs's defense team is pretty preposterous if you ask me. Also, I think that the 14-month sentence is unrealistic. It's just not going to happen. So let's talk about it. Combs argues that he has already served a typical sentence for defendants with similar records who have been found guilty of similar conduct. That is because, according to Combs, in the 63 cases the defense found where a non-cooperating defendant was convicted solely of a Mann Act offense with the same criminal history category as Combs, and a guidelines cross-reference did not apply, they said. The defense calculated the median sentence as 12 months incarceration and the mean sentence as 14 months incarceration. Merely being convicted of the same statute and having the same criminal history category as another defendant at the time of sentencing, however, does not reflexively and without further analysis render the defendants in these cases the most similarly situated to Combs. Sentencing is an individualized and fact-intensive exercise. Sentencing judge must make an individualized assessment based on the facts presented, which we went through some of those facts. We're talking about the crime, we're talking about the violence, we're talking about all of that. It is impossible to determine whether the cases citing in Defense Exhibit 68 are the most apt comparators to Combs without analysis of the individual facts and circumstances of each case, which the defense did not do. So what are they saying? They're saying it's impossible to determine whether or not the 14 months is appropriate without actually going through the specific and individual facts of each of the 63 cases, the defendants in each of those 63 cases, to see whether or not they're actually close in proximity in terms of similar cases to Combs. They're saying that it's an impossibility to even to compare Combs to these 63 cases and come up with 14 months without closer examination of the cases to show whether what the 14-month sentence was based on. And if the 14-month sentence that those folks were given is akin to the sentences imposed for far less culpable offenders. So basically, is 14 months appropriate for Combs along the basis of the less culpable offenders, the 63 that they came up with? Is it equal? You have to give closer examination, to which the defense did not do. That's what they're saying. They even say that some of the other defendants, the 63 comparable defendants involved in the transportation for prostitution, were shorter periods of time than Combs, and that there were no allegations of threats or violence within those cases as well, which I've told you for Combs raises recommended sentencing significantly for him. So they talk about the fact that the conduct is far from the defendant's conduct here. The conduct in those 63 cases, they say, is far from the defendant's conduct here in Combs's case. And that Combs's sentence should be substantially greater to reflect his greater culpability, meaning responsibility, knowing responsibility is what culpability is, the length of his criminal conduct, and the manipulation, threats, and violence he used against his victims, which we've just talked about. They go on and say, focusing on the cases in Defense Exhibit 68, which are the 63 cases that form the basis of the mathematical calculation that the defendant cites to justify the slap on the wrist he is seeking, there are ample reasons why these defendants are not similarly situated to Combs. So the DOJ is saying the 63 people that you provided are not similarly situated to Combs. The cases don't match. The cases are incomparable. The cases are not comparable to Combs's case. So therefore, you cannot base your sentencing, 14-month sentencing recommendation on these 63 cases that don't share the same amount of culpability. They don't share the same amount of violence. Matter of fact, many people in these other incomparable cases didn't even show violence. So therefore, the 14 months would be appropriate for them, but would not be appropriate for defendant Combs based on his propensity for violence. Okay? So that's the argument that the DOJ, they go right at it, and they go on and on. They go on, on, just on and on about proving why this 14-month slap on the wrist, as they call it, and I would agree with that, is not appropriate for Combs. They said, first and most critically, none of the defendants in these 63 incomparable cases have been sentenced for conduct involving physical violence, and are thus readily distinguished from the defendant's conduct here, which involved years of physical abuse that the defendant did not dispute at trial. As a matter of fact, not only did he not dispute it at trial, but his defense team actually talked about the fact and admitted that he was guilty of domestic violence at trial. This is an example, guys, of when you win the battle but lose the war. That's what this is, essentially. You won the battle of getting your client off on the RICO and the SEX trafficking, because you said this video is not showing SEX trafficking. This video is showing domestic violence. But you lose the war because the counts in which he was convicted of grossly become substantial when the defendant has shown a strong propensity for violence, of which you all, in your closing arguments and throughout the trial court phase, actually substantiated by saying he is a domestic violence abuser. Verbatim. Losing the battle, I'm sorry, winning the battle, but losing the war. That's what this is. So the DOJ, they really make a case for it here. I tell you guys, this is really something. This whole filing that they've made for this is substantial. I mean, they go up to, I think this is 161 pages, including the signature. Yeah, so 161 pages. I had it at 135. This is 160 one page filing for the 135 months imprisonment and why it is appropriate. And again, that equals to about 11 and a half years. The maximum imposed fine for this conviction would be about $500,000 under the statute. So they're asking the court to impose the maximum financial penalties to reflect the seriousness of the offense. And of course, obviously, there's no issue with Sean Combs being able to fork over that. But it's going to be the physical time in prison that's really going to haunt Mr. Combs. Because this is what he doesn't want to have to be responsible for. Now we recall, that his mother wrote, a letter, and she basically said, I want to live my last years with my son. And she's 84 years old. She's going to be 85 in December. And if he were to get the 11 and a half years that the DOJ is recommending, or even something a little less than that, even if it were 8 years, which I really, I don't know what it's going to look like, but we'll see. That would be significant for Ms. Combs. Significant, time to wait. There's a situation that I personally know about during my years, where there was a older woman who was like in her 80s or so, and her son, who was her only child, who took care of her, whatnot, all of her things. He actually ended up going to prison for shooting his wife, almost killing her, but didn't. Had to do 15 years. I think the lady was 80 when he went in, did the time. She died right before he was released. And so, these situations really usually don't bode well for those who are waiting on the outside, especially when the parent is older, because it's so much stress. It's so much stress. So, that's unfortunate for Ms. Combs. Obviously, she was mentioned in a civil lawsuit just a few months ago. And then I think the word is last week that civil lawsuit was dropped. It was a RICO civil lawsuit. She's no longer in that case, or the case itself has been dropped. What do I expect? I expect Mr. Combs to likely be sentenced anywhere between 5 and 8 years. That's what I expect. I was surprised that the Department of Probation was as high as they were. The recommended sentence was higher than I thought. I thought they were going to recommend somewhere in the 5 year range, but they recommended 7.5 years. I'm not surprised by the Department of Corrections. I'm sorry, the Department of Justice's recommendation, because Jay Clayton told us when he responded to the defense team's 61-page filing for the bail back in, I think it was July or August. Jay Clayton told us in that response, 10-page response, that he was seeking a significantly higher sentence based upon not only the federal guidelines, but these sentence enhancers that he's looking at here as it relates to Combs's propensity to violence. And also, as we learned in this filing that was filed last night, that part of the sentence enhancement is also the obstruction of justice that Sean Combs committed while he was held in the men's federal holding facility. So that is the obstruction of justice that they are utilizing as a sentence enhancer. It's part of the guidelines. So people have to really understand. I think people who are not in law enforcement or not uh, purveyors of the law, they don't understand the fact that a sentence can be a sentence in terms of what the federal or state guidelines are, but there is the possibility on pretty much most um counts, most counts, most convictions rather. There is opportunity rather for a sentence enhancement. It could be gun possession. I've seen that where you are a criminal, a previous offender, violent uh, offender, and you commit another act. You're accused of committing another act with a firearm. That is a sentence enhancer if that defendant is convicted. There could be several possibilities of sentence enhancers, and those sentence enhancers each have their own sentencing guidelines attached to them. So not only are you looking at the sentencing guidelines for the sentence itself, for the counts that they've been convicted of itself, but you're also looking at the sentencing guidelines as it relates to each and sentence enhancer. So that makes it something too. You can also have a sentence enhancer if you are a habitual offender. They call it at the DA's office, they call it the big bitch, is what they call it, because it is something that prosecutors can use against you if you continuously commit the same acts over and over again. That makes you an habitual offender, and that also sets you up for an sentencing enhancement on a conviction, which has its own sentencing guidelines on top of the conviction sentencing guidelines. And that is the reason why you all are seeing the significant sentence enhancement or significant sentence recommendation from the Department of Justice. Okay, now I'm going to read a little bit from these next. If you'd like to check out, cool. Thank you for joining. But for those of you who are interested in some of these letters that came the from the DOJ's witnesses in the case, I will read. I'm not going to read them in totality. I'm going to read in part, just sections of it, and then that's going to be it. But this first letter, and I'm reading it from my phone, guys, because I did not download this onto my screen. I guess I could have, but I didn't because I didn't want to get into all of that. But this letter is from Mia. And she says, I'm writing to you on behalf of my younger self. She says to Judge Submarinian. And then she talks about her days working for Sean Combs. She talks about how it was a dream to work for him. And then she goes into how she was groomed and she was exploited by Sean Combs. That she was stripped by him of her freedom, freedom of her safety. Uh, she goes on to say that she experienced manipulation, humiliation, coercion, and violence. She said that she was broken down. And then he alternated between, rewards and punishments, which some people would classify as a mind F, if you will, because that's essentially what it is, what she's saying about him. She goes on to say that he dangled her dreams before me like a carrot. Now, this is very much germane to what he was doing to Cassie, sort of dangling an opportunity to have this great, recording career. So to sort of keep her in line and keep her doing the freak offs or whatever he wanted her to do. And Miss Mia goes on to say that she lived in constant fear because his moods could determine my right to request for work related expenses. I think those of you who paid attention to the trial will recall that Mia sort of outlined where she was forced to pay for things herself. And that, he would sometimes pay for things, but by and large, she would have to pay for things herself. That's what it was. Now, this person has a lot of resources, but she was required to do that. And part of her initial lawsuit against Sean Combs had to do with some of that back pay that he owed to her for sort of having to front her own money, but never being reimbursed for that. For that fronting, which is ridiculous. I've always thought that is ridiculous, guys. Like, I've worked in the entertainment industry for many years, and I studios and people in entertainment will try to get away with that sort of thing if you let them. I've never allowed it. I've always told them book it on the studio expense account, or I've had a credit card, a company card. I got a company card and booked it on the company card or something like that. But I have always sort of railed against having to, front my own money for company trips and things of that nature. And when you work in entertainment, you have to do that a lot. And I've always thought, because I've worked at agencies who have tried to do that, it's not such an uncommon thing. And I've always thought that it's such a huge abuse of power. So, because many of the people who work in entertainment can't afford to front a hotel at the Four Seasons. They'll say, "Oh, we're all staying at the Four Seasons for a junket or whatever it might be." Oh, and you just, front that and we'll reimburse you. Well, how do you know I have the money to front that? Or at the the one hotel in Miami or something like that. Like, I don't have the money to front that. And so sort of making you sort of go through these embarrassing antics of, having to say that. And I don't have $1,000 to put on my card until 4 months from now when you decide to actually pay me back. No, I don't have that. So I'm gonna need you to front that. I've had these situations happen to me. Obviously, I've not been in her shoes, like verbatim with the abuse attached to it, but I have been in these situations where entertainment companies will try to take advantage of you in that way and get you to front your own money when in fact they should be. It's part of being in business. If you're going to be an agency, you're a studio, whatever you are, you need to cover expenses for your employees. So this is what she's saying Sean Combs would do to her, and that depending on how he felt, he may or may not decide to pay for it off the cuff. And that she had to act a certain way so that he would, sort of thing, or that so that she can even get her money back. And that's what part of her lawsuit was against him, the civil suit that people are referring to against him. Well, some of that was back pay for when he owed her money for these, company or work related expenses. She goes on to say that he controlled every part of her life. She said that she had to ask for permission for everything, when to sleep, when to eat, she says. Um, she says that she had to ask when she could go to the bathroom, when she could go to her own room, and even whether she could buy a tampon, she said. That he created a life where nothing was hers, and she lived in constant fear because his moods could determine my right to exist. Asking for compensation for my labor, she says, including overtime requests or reimbursements requests for work related expenses, she said, um would lead to him throwing a tantrum, yelling, and sometimes throwing objects in my direction in an effort to humiliate her. So you go in, you've already done the work trip, you've already paid the, $1,500 a hotel stay at the Four Seasons or something like that. I'm using this as an example. You get back from the work trip, you go in to ask for reimbursement. You presumably you put the request in, you haven't received the reimbursement, so you go in to ask you're checking on the reimbursement, when this is going to happen or whatever. And each time you do that, or when you do that, you've got a boss who throws something at you, starts yelling, going off, having a fit, all of that. And then she says that he did it to try to humiliate her. She says that he framed her request as stealing, and made her ashamed to expect any income at all. Through his financial manipulation, he kept her dependent and trapped, she said. Now, some of the kids from Making the Band, they're no longer kids, of course. Some of them are even older than me, but I say kids because that's the kind of show it was at the time. But some of the people from Making the Band have also sort of said the same thing, that he's, made them feel, guilty for even asking for any compensation at all. That many of them didn't see any, financial benefits to their uh or I should say, any financial compensation for the work that they did with Making the Band. Um, so, yeah, so she goes on to say that she said that, she says that she has struggled to feel safe in the wake, in to feel safe in any workplace because of her PTSD, because of everything that she's gone through. And she says that it has resulted in a fragmented professional record. And she's been left in bankruptcy and crippling debt, she says in her letter. So she said more, but we're going to leave it there. So that was Mia. Now, the chef. This is Chef Jordan. She said, I was there to witness the start of Sean Combs and Cassie's relationship. This has been extremely traumatizing in time in my life, the past year and a half, having to unearth the past and relive it all again. I spent the last 18 years building my career in the high profile sector, and this case has destroyed the life I worked hard to create. Discretion is the foundation. I didn't willingly participate in this case. What I recognize now, this is what happens with collective silence. My silence gave Sean Combs the space and time to grow into a more violent criminal, she says. And then she starts going into, when she worked for him and all of that. We have a letter. I believe this is from Capricorn Clark, and she talks about the fact that, I'm going to read her whole letter because I think it's very I find Capricorn Clark's letter to be particularly troubling. um and I think it's because, she had a history working for Death Row Records, and then she went on to, Bad Boy Entertainment. She was the one that was hooked up to the polygraph test, by Uncle Paulie, or whoever this person is, as part of that was part of Sean Combs' security team. Was kidnapped because she was unwillingly taken to a space for this polygraph test, and threatened to be thrown into the East River if she failed it, about some bogus jewelry that had been stolen, which she did not steal it. And this is after Sean Combs learned that she had worked for Death Row Records, so his he held rather his issue with Suge Knight over her head. She was sort of like a guilty by proxy because she used to work for an enemy of his, right? She goes, Dear Submarine, Judge Submarine, I testified in your courtroom in this case in May of 2025. As you heard, I worked for Puff from 2004 to 2012. And during that time, I got to know him very well. Since fired me in 2012, he has had me blacklisted from the industry, and I've had to take on multiple jobs to garner anything near my worth. Today, I am a single mother to a nonverbal autistic boy living in Los Angeles. This ordeal has taken 14 years from my life. My career trajectory halted at 33 years old, she says. What I lived through working for Puff in particular. The events of December 2011 altered the course of my life and have haunted me for years. I feel that I paid with my life for the events that transpired that fateful day. We had to relive in federal court. I never wanted this. For many years, I could tell my story and lived in fear of Puff and fear of how I would feed my son. About a year and a half ago, Homeland Security case agents found me and asked me what happened. Those agents changed my life, and I would like to say that the Southern District of New York is the epitome of prestige and professionalism. I was handled with the ultimate care. But testifying publicly in front of Puff and his supporters was one of the hardest moments of my life, and every last word you heard from me was the truth. Yet I felt, and to be honest, still feel like I had to fight to prove that I am a victim, because the purpose of kidnapping me wasn't for sex trafficking. What it was for was something more serious, more sinister and grave: violence and absolute power, unchecked in the ultra rich and famous. It's okay. It's insane to me. Sorry guys. It's insane to me that of all the things the people heard, 2 counts of prostitution of men is the only thing that remains on the table. I wanted to speak up, tell the truth, and do the right thing when I was asked to testify, but I am afraid that women and girls in America feel less protected than ever watching what just happened. The lesson seems to be that we should not speak up, not call law enforcement for help, and not say anything, but instead keep our head down and try to make a way regardless of what happens to us. I am afraid this may be the only realistic way to proceed in the modern world, she says. The last ray of light is that you provide justice to us. You have a chance to finally help him and know that he cannot just do what he wants to people. There are repercussions and consequences. He cannot just destroy other people's lives. Karma will come back in hundredfold ways. I would like Sean Combs to serve additional time in a correctional institution. I truly believe that serving more time will save Puff's life, as time away from his money, drugs, and power is the only punishment he will recognize. I hope Puff has life on the other side of his time to make good on the changes he knows he has to make, to spend time with his family and get a chance to correct the damage he has so recklessly done to so many people who only meant well by him. Thank you, Your Honor, for your time, consideration, and for hearing us finally. God bless Capricorn Clark. I thought hers was particularly interesting. Devontae Nash also did a letter, but I talked about him in his filing the other week, so I don't kind of want to go over that because he kind of says some of the same things, in that, he felt like he didn't have control of his life, and that, he was scared for his life. He's still afraid for his life. All valid, all valid. So that is it. At the end of it, Sean Combs is the recommended sentence from the Department of Corrections, or I keep saying Department of Corrections. The Department of Justice on this is 11 and a half years, which is the 135 months. The Department of Probation has asked for 7.5 years. This is according to the defense. So the Department of Probation will come with their official recommendation probably within the next day or two, but it will be made public prior to the hearing on the 3rd. And then, of course, Sean Combs' defense team is looking for 14 months, which is a slap on the wrist and essentially is time served. Judge Pomeranian has not brought down the ruling on the request for acquittal or request for a new trial from Sean Combs' team based upon the supposed, in their opinion, incorrect definition of the term prostitution as it relates to the Mann Act. So we will be waiting on that. So This is our first episode for the day. Thanks so much, ladies and gentlemen. We will come back to you later on today with the rest of the show for the day for Cast and Court TV. We appreciate you locking in with us. Please do not forget to like and subscribe if you would like to support the channel. Please do so. Supporting the channel allows me to receive the documents that I showed you there on the screen. Those documents are not free. Those documents cost money from the court. So getting those documents, getting those letters, anything like that, all of those are all of those costs, and as because it's part of the court filing. So if you would like to support the channel, which basically allows me to purchase the things that I need to purchase to give you the news that you want, please do so. Thank you very much. Appreciate you guys. We'll check in with you later today with the next episode of Cast Court TV. This has been your girl, Miss Public Info, with the latest and greatest, sometimes hated updates of your most high profile cases going on around the country. We appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to you later. All right, guys. Peace.